How does a man step out from the shadow of a colossus? For 40 years, the people of Israel had known only one leader, Moses. He was the lawgiver, the prophet, the man who spoke with God face to face. But now, Moses was gone. His mantle, heavy with the destiny of a nation, had fallen upon his second-in-command, Joshua. He stands now on the dusty plains of Moab, the grit of the wilderness still on his sandals. Below him, the sprawling camp of Israel murmurs with a collective, anxious breath, and across the Jordan River, shimmering in the heat, lies the prize and the peril, the promised land of Canaan. The era of aimless wandering was over. An age of conquest was about to begin. This was not a position Joshua had sought, but one thrust upon him by divine decree. The voice that once thundered from a burning bush and a smoking mountain now spoke to him, its command unequivocal. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan." There was no room for debate, no space for doubt. It was a transfer of authority as absolute as it was terrifying. The hope and future of an entire people now rested squarely on his shoulders. After 40 years of following, of learning, of witnessing, Joshua had to become the one who leads. This divine appointment was both a profound validation and an immense burden, cementing his leadership while demanding a faith he had only ever seen modeled by his mentor. But with the command came a promise so staggering it defied all military logic. It was a guarantee of victory, a divine deed of ownership for the land before them. "Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you," the voice declared. This was not a call to a hopeful campaign. It was an instruction to claim a preordained inheritance. From the southern wilderness to the great river Euphrates, the land was theirs. For a nation of former slaves, a people whose identity was forged in bondage and refined in the desert, this promise was everything.
It transformed what seemed like a desperate gamble into the certain fulfillment of a sacred, ancient covenant. The challenge of succeeding a legendary predecessor is a timeless human story, one that echoes in the corridors of power and the quiet transitions of family even today. True leadership requires the courage to honor a powerful past while forging an entirely new future. For Joshua, this divine promise was not a blank check. It was conditional on his own courage and his unwavering adherence to the law Moses had delivered. He now possessed both the authority to lead and the absolute assurance of divine backing. His first test, however, would not be a frontal assault on an enemy army. It would begin in the shadows, with a secret mission to infiltrate the most formidable obstacle in their path, the legendary walled city of Jericho. How do you conquer a city built to be unconquerable? Joshua, now stepping fully from Moses' shadow, understood that his first strategic move was not a test of force, but a test of sight. Before him stood Jericho, a monolithic fortress of sun-baked stone, the defiant gateway to Canaan. It was a city that mocked armies with its sheer verticality. And so Joshua did not send an army, he sent 2 men. Their mission was simple in its instruction, yet perilous in its execution: to see the land, especially Jericho, and bring back a report. They were to be his eyes inside the lion's den. As dusk bled across the sky, the spies slipped through the city gates, melting into the labyrinth of narrow, shadowed streets. They found what they were looking for at the edge of the city, in a house built directly into the formidable outer wall. It was a place owned by a woman named Rahab. Her home, a hub of quiet, illicit transactions, provided the perfect cover. It was a place on the margins of society, and for that very reason, it was a place of opportunity, a place where a promise could be made.
Soon, the heavy fists of the king's soldiers were pounding on her wooden door. "Bring out the men who came to you," they demanded, their voices sharp with authority. But Rahab, with a composure born of a life lived on the edge, had already hidden the spies among stalks of flax drying on her flat roof. She faced the soldiers and calmly sent them on a futile chase toward the river fords. Her deception was absolute, her risk total. Why would a citizen of a mighty fortified city risk everything for foreign invaders? Because her act of treason was, in reality, an act of profound and desperate faith. In the quiet of the night, she confessed her belief to the hidden men. She told them that the terror of their God had already fallen upon her people, that every heart in Jericho had melted in fear at the stories of the Red Sea parting and the kings they had defeated. She had seen a future that her own king could not, and so she asked for a pledge. "Swear to me by the Lord," she pleaded, "that as I have shown you kindness, you will show kindness to my family." They agreed. The sign of their covenant would be a single scarlet cord hung from her window, a fragile crimson beacon of hope against the cold, unyielding stone. This one thread would separate life from death when the armies of Israel returned. Lowered by that same cord from her window, the spies escaped into the night. They carried back more than military intelligence about the city's defenses. They carried the story of an unlikely ally, a testament to a faith that had crossed enemy lines. This ancient account of espionage and allegiance still resonates, teaching us that courage and conviction can be found in the most unexpected people and can fundamentally alter the course of history. With loyalty now secured inside the very walls of his target, Joshua could prepare his people for what was to come. How does an entire nation walk through a raging flood? After 40 years of wandering, this was the final barrier.
Before them lay the Jordan River, not as a gentle stream, but as a violent, muddy torrent at the height of its spring flood stage. The spies had returned with their report, but the path to Jericho was now submerged. For Joshua, this was his first great public test. His command was not to build a bridge, or construct rafts, or wait for the waters to recede. He told the priests to hoist the Ark of the Covenant onto their shoulders and walk directly into the churning current. The priests, robed in white linen, moved toward the water's edge, the golden ark heavy on their shoulders. A nation of hundreds of thousands watched in hushed silence, the river's roar the only sound. This was an act of supreme, audacious faith, a public demonstration that God, not armies, would give them the land. Joshua was staking his entire leadership on this single, impossible command. Could faith truly command the forces of nature? This was more than a river crossing. It was the defining moment for a new generation. It all came down to a single step of faith. The moment the priest's feet touched the churning water, the impossible happened. The river simply stopped. Far upstream, the waters began to pile up in a single, towering, liquid wall, while downstream, the riverbed emptied, exposing dry, stony ground. The miracle was a powerful and deliberate echo of the Red Sea crossing under Moses, a clear and undeniable signal to the people that the same divine power that was with their fathers was now with them. This was Joshua's anointing, an event that cemented his authority in a way no speech or decree ever could. For hours, the nation crossed on dry land. A river of people flowed past the ark, held steadfast by the priests in the very middle of the riverbed. Joshua then commanded 12 men, one from each tribe, to take 12 stones from that very spot as a memorial. These were not to be ordinary stones. They would be witnesses of water and faith, a physical anchor for a spiritual memory.
The act of creating memorials to remember moments of deliverance is a deeply human impulse, a way we teach future generations about their heritage and their identity. Now, standing on the western bank, the Israelites could feel the palpable fear this miracle had struck into the hearts of the Canaanite kings. They stood at last on the plains of Jericho, their eyes fixed on the city's impenetrable walls, knowing the real battle was yet to begin. Why would a conquering army poised to strike pause for a painful and disabling ritual? After the miraculous crossing of the Jordan, the Israelites stood on enemy soil, with Jericho's walls looming before them. Military logic screamed for a swift, decisive strike, while their foes were paralyzed with terror. Instead, at their new camp in Gilgal, Joshua received a strange and startling command. Before a single sword was drawn for battle, the nation must first be consecrated. An entire generation of men, born during the 40 years of wandering, had to enter the covenant through the rite of circumcision. It was an ancient sign of their unique bond with God, but it was also an act of profound vulnerability,
rendering the army's fighting men helpless for days. This was not military strategy, it was an act of spiritual allegiance. In the quiet of the camp, under the foreign Canaanite sun, Joshua oversaw the rite with knives of flint. These men now bore the ancient mark of their identity, a physical break from the faithless past of their fathers who had perished in the wilderness. They were declaring, in the most personal way imaginable, who they were and to whom they belonged. Their strength would not come from their spears or their shields, but from their covenant. To perform this act in the shadow of Jericho's walls was a radical statement. This victory would belong to God alone. Once the men had healed, another powerful act of remembrance occurred. They celebrated the Passover for the first time in the Promised Land.
They roasted lambs and prepared unleavened bread, not with the mysterious manna from heaven, but with the grain harvested from the land of Canaan itself. And on the very next day, the heavenly provision that had sustained them for 4 decades ceased forever. Their sustenance would now come from the soil they were about to conquer. It was a meal that served as a final lesson in trusting a new kind of provision before the ultimate test. This sacred pause at Gilgal reveals a core truth about the campaign to come. Joshua's leadership was demonstrated first in obedience, not in battlefield tactics. Prioritizing spiritual readiness over strategic advantage is a timeless and difficult lesson. It teaches that our greatest battles are often won internally, by clarifying our identity and our purpose before we ever step onto the field. With covenant renewed and identity affirmed, the nation was finally ready. They looked towards the unconquerable city. The time for waiting was over, but the strategy for victory would come from a source no one could have predicted. When a leader prepares for war, what is his final, private move? After the rituals of covenant at Gilgal, Joshua was alone, the weight of an entire nation pressing down on him. In the fading light of day, he surveyed the impenetrable walls of Jericho, a silent stone testament to the challenge that lay ahead. His mind was likely racing with tactics, with the complex strategies required for a protracted and bloody siege. And then, suddenly, he was no longer alone. A man stood before him, his presence radiating an undeniable authority, a drawn sword gleaming ominously in his hand. Instinct took over. Joshua, the seasoned general, challenged the stranger with the only question that mattered in that moment: "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The response he received was not the one he expected. It was a complete reframing of the entire conflict, a tectonic shift in perspective.
"Neither," the figure replied with calm finality, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." This was not an ally to be recruited or an enemy to be fought. This was the true general, arriving to take his post on the field of battle. In that instant, Joshua the commander became Joshua the subordinate. He fell on his face in worship, his human authority and military rank dissolving before the presence of absolute divine power. The commander's next words forged a direct link back to Israel's sacred past, echoing the moment Moses stood before the burning bush. "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." The very ground outside Jericho, deep in enemy territory, was instantly consecrated by this divine presence. This was no longer just a battlefield. It was now a sanctuary, a place of worship. How does a general, tasked with leading a massive invasion, respond when he is told he is not ultimately in charge of the fight? He surrenders his command. This encounter was the pivotal moment for the entire campaign. It was the final, definitive confirmation that the victory would not come from Joshua's military prowess or the strength of his soldiers. The spies had found a city paralyzed by fear. The Jordan River had parted by a divine hand, and now the unseen celestial army had its commander on the ground. The battle for Jericho was God's to wage. This timeless lesson teaches that the greatest leadership often involves recognizing when to step aside, surrendering our own carefully laid strategies to a higher purpose. It is the profound act of faith that must precede any meaningful victory. Joshua was now ready to receive his orders,
but the battle plan he was about to be given would defy all military logic and human reason. How do you tear down a fortress without swinging a single sword? After his encounter with the divine commander, Joshua received a battle plan unlike any in the history of warfare.
It was a strategy of faith, ritual, and sound. There would be no siege engines, no battering rams, no ladders to scale the stone. The instructions were bizarrely, divinely specific. For 6 days, the entire army was to march around the city of Jericho 1 time each day, and they were to do so in complete and utter silence. In the lead would be the armed men, followed by 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets made of ram's horns. Behind them, the sacred Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence that had parted the Jordan, would be carried, with a rear guard following. Imagine a young soldier on that first day, his hand gripping his spear, the leather tight in his palm. The only sounds are the rhythmic shuffle of thousands of sandals on dry earth and the constant bleeding blast from the 7 horns. He dares not speak, for the command for silence was absolute. He can feel the eyes of Jericho's watchmen on the walls above, their expressions a mixture of confusion, mockery, and contempt. This was not war as he knew it. This was something else entirely. What must the city's defenders have thought watching this silent, circular parade day after day? At first, perhaps it was a curiosity, then an object of ridicule. But as the days wore on, the ritual must have become a form of psychological warfare, a ceremony of intimidation that defied all military logic. The daily procession was a living, breathing clock, counting down to a moment they could not possibly comprehend. This wasn't just an army laying siege. It was a priesthood enacting a verdict. We now recognize that profound change often follows patterns that defy convention, where discipline and patience become more potent than brute force. The silent march was a testament to absolute obedience. But what would happen when, on the 7th day, the silence was finally commanded to be broken? For 6 days, the pattern held.
Joshua ensured every detail of the commander's plan was followed without the slightest deviation. Each morning, the silent march began, once around the city and then back to the camp at Gilgal. The sun rose and set on this bizarre tableau. Inside Jericho, confusion likely hardened into a brittle, unspoken fear. For the Israelites, a people who had wandered restlessly for 40 years, this was the ultimate test of patience, a final lesson in trusting a plan that made no earthly sense. After 6 identical days of this unnerving ritual, the sun set on a city holding its breath. Everyone, both inside and outside the walls, knew something was about to change. The 7th day was dawning. After 6 days of deafening silence, the 7th day dawned with a command for overwhelming sound. Before sunrise, the Israelite camp stirred in the pre-dawn chill. The ground itself seemed to tremble as thousands of people began to move, their purpose now palpable after a week of silent marching. The strange strategy was reaching its final, decisive moment. This day was not for quiet obedience. It was for a triumphant, earth-shaking noise. The procession began its first circuit, then a second. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them. A third, 4, 5, 6 times they circled the city, the endless shuffle of feet and the piercing cry of the priest's trumpets the only sound. From the walls, the people of Jericho watched, their initial scorn long since replaced by a gnawing dread. What could this exhausting 7-fold repetition possibly mean? The 7th circuit was finally complete. The vast column of people halted. A tense, expectant quiet fell over the plains. Then Joshua's voice cut through the air. "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The 7 priests raised their ram's horns, blowing a single, long, piercing blast that seemed to tear the sky. It was the signal. And then came the roar.
It was the collective voice of an entire nation, releasing 40 years of wandering, of deferred hope, and of absolute faith in one shattering moment. The ground shook violently. The mighty stones of Jericho, those ancient symbols of impenetrable strength, did not just crumble, they collapsed downward into themselves, creating a ruinous ramp into the city. The impossible had happened.
The story reminds us that the most formidable walls in our own lives sometimes fall not to brute force, but to persistent, unified faith in a promise. The path was now clear. The way into the city laid terrifyingly bare. What follows the sound that shatters stone? A human flood. The shout on the seventh day broke more than Jericho's walls. It broke its will to resist. The Israelite army surged forward, each man straight ahead, instruments of a divine verdict delivered long ago. Joshua's command was absolute. The city and everything in it was devoted to God for destruction. Every living thing, man and woman, young and old, faced the sword. It was a grim and terrible sentence. No personal plunder was allowed. All the silver, gold, and vessels of bronze and iron were to be consecrated to the Lord's treasury. This was not a war for riches. It was a holy war, intended to cleanse the land. But amid the chaos and the smoke, two men had a different mission. The same two spies who had hidden on Rahab's roof now navigated the ruined streets, their eyes searching for a fragile sign of hope, a single scarlet cord dangling from the remnant of a window. They found her house intact, an island of mercy in a sea of destruction. Inside, Rahab and her family waited, their fate hanging on a promise made in the dark. It was a promise that was about to be kept. Why, in an act of such total annihilation, was this one promise held so sacred? It reveals that the covenant of destruction was not blind, that an act of faith, even from an outsider, a Canaanite, was seen and honored.
The spies led Rahab and her kin from the rubble of the city to safety. Her courage was repaid with life for her entire household. This act of mercy testifies that integrity can build a foundation that will outlast any stone wall. It is a powerful reminder that keeping one's word, especially when it is difficult, is an act of the highest honor.